Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. The morning mist clings to the Tennessee hills like a burial shroud, reluctant to release its grip on the land below. Here, where the earth rolls in gentle waves of green and gold, where the Red Creek cuts through limestone and clay on its endless journey south, there exists a patch of ground that even now, more than 2 centuries later, carries the weight of unspeakable darkness. The locals don't speak of it much anymore. Some stories, they say, are better left buried. But the land remembers. The land always remembers. It's 1807, and a farmer named Jacob Mills is plowing a field he recently purchased at auction, a stretch of bottomland along the creek that should have been prime farmland. His plow hits something solid, and he assumes it's a stone. Tennessee soil is full of them, stubborn limestone chunks that test a man's patience and his equipment. But when he digs around the obstruction, what emerges isn't stone at all. It's bone. Human bone. And it's not alone. Within hours, Jacob has unearthed fragments of at least 3 separate skeletons, their remains mingled in the dark earth like some macabre harvest. His hands shake as he backs away from the excavation, his mind racing to make sense of what he's found. This land, he knows, once belonged to the Harper family, a name that even 6 years after their disappearance still carries an uncomfortable weight in Red Creek. The family that seemed to vanish into the Tennessee night, leaving behind only whispers and suspicions that no one dared voice too loudly. By the time the sheriff arrives, a crowd has gathered. Women clutch their shawls against a wind that seems colder than the season warrants. Men stand in tight clusters, speaking in low voices, their eyes darting between the exposed graves and the overgrown ruins of what was once the Harper farmhouse. The building still stands barely. Its windows are empty eye sockets staring across the fields, its door hanging at an angle that suggests violence rather than mere neglect. No one has lived here since the fire. No one would dare. Sheriff Thomas Crawford, who replaced William Cobb 2 years prior, oversees the excavation with a grim expression. He's heard the stories, of course. Every lawman in this part of Tennessee has heard about the Harpers. But hearing stories and confronting physical evidence are 2 entirely different experiences. As the afternoon wears on and more remains are uncovered, 7 bodies, then 12, then too many to count in the fading light, Crawford finds himself facing a truth that will haunt him for the rest of his days. The whispers were right. The suspicions were justified. And the evil that once occupied this land was far worse than anyone had dared imagine. But to understand what happened here, to truly comprehend the depths of depravity that transformed a simple Tennessee farm into a killing ground, we must go back to the beginning, back to 1801, when a family arrived in Red Creek with a wagon full of belongings and secrets that would eventually bleed into the very soil beneath their feet. The Harper family came to Red Creek in the autumn of 1801, arriving with little fanfare and even less explanation. Elijah Harper, the patriarch, was a man in his middle 40s, tall, rail-thin, with eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His wife, Martha, was a decade younger, a woman whose beauty had been weathered by hardship into something harder, something that made neighbors uneasy without quite knowing why. They brought with them 4 children. 2 sons, Josiah and Caleb, aged 17 and 15 respectively, and 2 daughters, Sarah, 13, and little Abigail, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They purchased 40 acres along Red Creek from a widow eager to settle her late husband's estate and return east to her family. The price was fair, perhaps even generous, and the land itself was good, fertile bottomland perfect for corn and tobacco, with enough timber to build a proper homestead and a creek that never ran dry even in the worst droughts. To all appearances, the Harpers were simply another family seeking opportunity in the expanding frontier, no different from dozens of others who'd settled the valley over the past decade. But from the very beginning, something felt off about the Harper family. The neighbors noticed it first in small ways, the kinds of details that seem insignificant individually, but accumulate into an undeniable sense of wrongness. The Harpers built their farmhouse with remarkable speed, working from dawn until well past dark. but they always stopped their labor when anyone approached. They were polite enough when encountered on the road or at the general store in Red Creek, but the conversations never went beyond basic pleasantries. Invitations to church were declined. Offers of assistance with the harvest went unanswered. The family, it seemed, had no interest in becoming part of the community they'd joined. Samuel Wright, who owned the adjacent property, later told investigators that he'd attempted to be neighborly in those early months. "I brought them a basket of apples from our orchard," he recalled, as was customary when new folks settled nearby. "Elijah met me at the boundary of his land, wouldn't even let me cross onto his property proper, took the apples with barely a word of thanks, and stood there watching me until I'd mounted my horse and ridden out of sight. Made my skin crawl the way he just stared without blinking, like a snake watching a mouse hole." Others reported similar experiences. Margaret Thornton, whose husband operated the mill where local farmers brought their grain, remembered Martha Harper's visits with particular unease. She'd come in maybe once a month, always alone, always in the same dark dress that hung on her like she was wasting away beneath it. She'd speak only when necessary, never a kind word, never a smile, never any of the small talk that makes business more pleasant. But it was her eyes I remember most. They had a haunted quality, like she was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. Something terrible. The children were rarely seen. Young Abigail appeared occasionally, usually standing at the edge of the property line, watching the road with an intensity that seemed wrong for a child her age. The older children worked the fields with their father and brothers, but they never attended the schoolhouse that had opened in Red Creek in 1799, never participated in the community gatherings that were so essential to frontier social life. When directly questioned about this, Elijah Harper stated simply that he educated his children himself and saw no need for them to waste time on frivolous socializing when there was work to be done on the farm. The farmhouse itself became a source of speculation and unease. It was larger than most homesteads in the area, built with a peculiar attention to privacy. The windows were small and set high in the walls, making it impossible for passers-by to see inside. A fence went up around the property within the first 6 months, not a simple split-rail fence like most farms used, but a solid construction of vertical boards that blocked all view of the yard and outbuildings. The gate was kept locked, and more than one visitor reported that even when someone was clearly home, knocking would go unanswered for long minutes until Elijah would finally emerge, never opening the gate, never inviting anyone inside. It was like they were hiding something, Samuel Wright would later testify. Like they'd come here specifically because they wanted to be left alone, wanted to conduct their business without prying eyes. At the time, we thought perhaps they were simply private people, maybe running from some trouble back east. The frontier attracted all kinds, and most folks figured a man's past was his own concern as long as he caused no trouble in the present. But looking back, knowing what we know now, that fence wasn't built to keep people out. It was built to hide what was happening inside. By the spring of 1802, the Harper farm was fully operational. They grew corn primarily, with some tobacco and vegetables for their own use. Elijah made periodic trips to Red Creek to sell grain and purchase supplies, always paying in cash, always conducting his business with minimal conversation. The family had achieved exactly what they seemed to want: isolation within the community, a self-sufficient existence that required almost no interaction with their neighbors. But even as the Harpers receded into their private world behind that fence, stories began to circulate about strange occurrences at the farm. Travelers on the road reported hearing screams at night, high-pitched and agonized, cut off abruptly as if silenced by force. When questioned, the Harpers claimed it was nothing more than animals, foxes and bobcats that made terrible sounds during mating season. The explanation was plausible enough, and without proof of anything sinister, the matter was dropped. A wandering preacher named Reverend Nathaniel Boone later recorded in his journal an encounter that, in hindsight, carried ominous significance. "I stopped at the Harper farm on a day in June, seeking only water for myself and my horse. The father met me at the gate with a rifle in hand, though he made no threatening gesture with it. When I asked if I might preach to his family, as was my custom, he told me they had no need of salvation, that they'd found their own path to grace. His exact words chill me even now. We've learned that God has many faces, Reverend, and not all of them are merciful. I left that place with a darkness in my spirit, certain that evil had taken root there. The winter of 1802 was harsh, with snow falling earlier and deeper than usual. The roads became nearly impassable, and most families in the area hunkered down, surviving on stored provisions and waiting for spring. The Harpers were rarely seen during these months, though smoke rose regularly from their chimney, and the few travelers who passed reported lights burning in the windows late into the night. It was during this period that the first person vanished. His name was Thomas Eldridge, a peddler who traveled a circuit through the Tennessee backcountry, selling needles, thread, simple tools, and other goods that made frontier life slightly more bearable. He'd been making the same circuit for 5 years, staying at the same homes and inns, arriving on a schedule you could practically set a clock by. In early March of 1803, he was expected at the Thornton Inn in Red Creek but never arrived. His route would have taken him past the Harper farm. He was never seen again. At first, his disappearance caused little alarm. The roads were treacherous, and it was entirely possible he'd taken a fall, that his horse had thrown him into a ravine, that he'd fallen ill and died in some lonely spot between settlements. Search parties went out when the weather improved, but they found no trace of Thomas Eldridge or his wagon. Eventually, people stopped looking. The frontier was dangerous, and death came in countless ways. One missing peddler, tragic though it was, didn't necessarily indicate anything sinister, but Thomas Eldridge was only the first. By the summer of 1803, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, even if no one wanted to voice their suspicions aloud. A young couple traveling to Nashville to join the wife's family never arrived at their destination. A surveyor working on mapping the territory for potential settlement was last seen riding along Red Creek. 2 brothers hauling a load of hides to market in Knoxville vanished without a trace. A widow traveling with her teenage daughter to live with relatives in Kentucky disappeared somewhere between Red Creek and the next settlement to the north. All of these people had one thing in common. Their routes took them past the Harper farm, and all of them vanished during the hours of darkness, when the road was lonely and help was miles away. The taverns and general stores of Red Creek buzzed with whispered speculation. Men gathered to drink and voice suspicions they'd never speak in daylight. Women clutched their children closer and warned them never to wander near the Harper property. But fear of being wrong, of accusing an innocent family of monstrous crimes without proof, kept everyone silent. Besides, what exactly would they say? That travelers were disappearing near the Harper farm? The Harpers weren't the only ones living along that stretch of road. Without evidence, without bodies, without any proof beyond an accumulation of suspicious circumstances, there was nothing concrete to accuse them of. It was Samuel Wright who finally approached Sheriff William Cobb with his concerns. "I know how it sounds," he told the lawman, "and I know we've got nothing but coincidence and bad feelings, but that family isn't right, Sheriff. Something evil is happening on that land, and if we don't act, more innocent people are going to die. I can feel it in my bones." Sheriff Cobb was in a difficult position. He too had heard the rumors, had noted the pattern of disappearances along that particular stretch of road, but he was also bound by law and evidence, and suspicion alone wasn't grounds for action. However, the pressure was mounting, and he couldn't ignore the concerns of the community he'd sworn to protect. In late August of 1803, he decided to pay a visit to the Harper farm, not to accuse, but simply to ask questions, to get a feel for the family, to see with his own eyes if there was any substance to the dark whispers that had been circulating for months. He brought his deputy, a young man named Henry Moss, and arrived at the Harper farm on a Tuesday morning when the late summer sun was still climbing toward its zenith. The fence gate was closed and presumably locked, so Cobb called out, announcing his presence and his official capacity. For several long minutes there was no response. The farm was eerily quiet. No sound of animals, no voices, nothing but the whisper of wind through the corn and the constant murmur of Red Creek in the distance. Just as Cobb was preparing to call out again, the front door of the farmhouse opened. Elijah Harper emerged, moving with an unhurried gait that suggested he had all the time in the world and saw no particular urgency in the sheriff's visit. He crossed the yard, his boots crunching on the packed earth, and approached the gate without opening it. "Sheriff?" he said by way of greeting, his voice as flat and emotionless as a January pond. "What brings the law to my property?" Cobb explained that there had been several disappearances in the area, that concerned citizens had noted the proximity of the Harper farm to where these people were last seen, and that he was simply making inquiries of all residents along this stretch of road. His tone was professional, non-accusatory, but he watched Harper's face carefully for any reaction that might confirm or dispel the community's suspicions. Harper's expression never changed. "Disappearances," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Can't say I know anything about that. We keep to ourselves here, mind our own affairs. If folks are vanishing from the road, that's a tragedy, but it's nothing to do with us." Deputy Moss, standing slightly behind the sheriff, later described the encounter in detail to investigators. "There was something wrong about the way he spoke," Moss recalled. "The words were appropriate, cooperative even, but there was no emotion behind them. It was like talking to a man who'd forgotten how to be human, who was just going through the motions of a conversation without really understanding its purpose. And his eyes, I've never seen eyes like that before or since. Cole doesn't begin to describe it. They were empty, like looking into a well that goes down to nothing." Sheriff Cobb asked if he might look around the property, just to put the community's mind at ease. Harper refused, stating that he had rights as a property owner and saw no reason to allow a search without cause. He was within his legal rights, and Cobb couldn't push the matter without more evidence. But before leaving, the sheriff asked one more question. "Have you seen anyone unusual along the road? Any travelers passing through at odd hours?" Harper paused for just a moment before answering. "We retire early and rise with the sun, Sheriff. What happens on the road after dark is none of our concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." He turned and walked back to the house without another word, dismissing the lawmen as if they were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to his day. As Cobb and Moss rode away from the farm, the deputy expressed what they were both thinking. "That man is guilty of something, Sheriff. I'd stake my life on it. But proving it is another matter entirely." Cobb nodded grimly. "Keep your eyes and ears open, Henry. If they're doing what people suspect, eventually they'll make a mistake. Eventually we'll catch them." But even as he said it, Sheriff William Cobb had no idea how many lives had already been taken, how many bodies were already buried beneath the soil of the Harper farm, or how close he'd come that morning to uncovering one of the most horrific killing sprees in Tennessee's history. He also didn't know that his visit had spooked the Harper family, made them more cautious, and that their careful caution would allow them to continue their murderous activities for several more years before justice finally caught up with them. That night, travelers on the road past the Harper farm reported seeing unusual activity on the property, lantern light moving through the fields long after midnight, the sound of digging, of shovels biting into earth. Some claimed they heard voices raised in argument, and one man swore he heard a woman crying, though the sound was cut off abruptly as if silenced by force. But by morning the farm was quiet again, and when people passed by in daylight everything appeared normal. Just another hard-scrabbled Tennessee farm, just another family trying to carve out an existence on the frontier. The disappearances continued. In September, a merchant traveling with a wagon full of goods failed to reach his destination. In October, a family of 4, parents and 2 young children, vanished somewhere between Red Creek and the next town north. Witnesses at the Red Creek General Store recalled seeing them purchase supplies in the afternoon, talking excitedly about the new land they'd claimed further north, about the home they'd build, the future they'd create. That future never came. They were never seen again. The winter of 1803 brought a temporary lull, but whether this was due to weather making travel rare or to the Harper family exercising caution after the sheriff's visit, no one could say. But spring brought a renewal of the horror. Bodies didn't turn up, but people continued to disappear with sickening regularity. The road past the Harper farm gained a reputation, and travelers began going miles out of their way to avoid it, preferring to add hours or even a full day to their journey, rather than risk passing that cursed stretch of land after dark. But not everyone had a choice. Not everyone had the luxury of alternate routes or the knowledge of which farms to avoid. And the Harper family, whatever their methods, whatever psychological or practical techniques they employed to identify and capture their victims, proved terrifyingly efficient at their deadly work. It wasn't until the spring of 1805 that the first solid evidence emerged, not through detective work or investigation, but through the simple, unstoppable forces of nature. The rains came in late April of that year, with an intensity that old-timers claimed they'd never witnessed before. Day after day, the skies opened, and water poured down in sheets that turned roads to rivers and fields to lakes. Red Creek swelled beyond its banks, flooding the bottomland and transforming the landscape into a muddy, waterlogged nightmare. The downpour lasted for nearly 2 weeks before finally clearing, leaving behind destruction that would take months to fully repair. Among the properties hit hardest was the Harper farm. Their fields, situated in the rich bottomland that should have been their greatest asset, took the full force of the flooding. Water surged across their property, eroding soil, flattening crops, and reshaping the land itself. When the waters finally receded, they left behind not just mud and debris, but something far more horrifying. It was a boy named Matthew Collins, playing along the swollen creek in the days after the flood, who made the discovery. He was collecting interesting stones and pieces of driftwood when he spotted something unusual, protruding from a mud bank near the edge of what had been the Harper cornfield. At first glance, it looked like a broken tree branch, bleached white by time and weather. But as he moved closer, recognition dawned with sickening clarity. It wasn't a branch at all. It was bone. Human bone. An arm, or what remained of one, the hand still intact with fingers curled as if grasping at something that had long since slipped away. Matthew ran, his young legs pumping with the speed of pure terror, not stopping until he'd reached his father's workshop nearly a mile away. The story tumbled out of him in gasps and sobs, and within the hour a group of men had assembled to investigate. What they found at the Harper farm turned the whispered suspicions of 2 years into undeniable, horrifying truth. The flood had been violent enough to shift the topsoil and expose what had been carefully hidden beneath. Where the water had carved new channels through the Harper property, bones protruded from the muddy earth like grotesque crops, not just one body, but many, too many. The remains were scattered, mixed together, in some cases little more than fragments ground into the soil itself. But there was no mistaking what they were, no possibility of innocent explanation. Someone rode for Sheriff Cobb while others stood guard at the site, though none of them got any closer to the Harper farmhouse than necessary. The fence still stood, damaged in places by the flood but largely intact, and behind it the farm was eerily quiet. No one emerged from the house. No one acknowledged the crowd gathering at their property line. The Harper family, if they were home, gave no indication that they were aware of or concerned about the discovery unfolding in their fields. When Sheriff Cobb arrived, he brought every able-bodied man he could deputize on short notice. Whatever legal niceties had prevented him from searching the property 2 years earlier no longer applied. There was evidence of crimes here, terrible crimes, and he was within his rights to investigate fully. The gate was broken open, and the men entered the Harper property with a mixture of determination and dread. The farmhouse door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, as if inviting entry. Cobb called out, announcing his presence, but received no response. With weapons drawn, several men entered while others secured the outbuildings and began the grim task of documenting what the flood had revealed. The interior of the Harper house defied expectations. It was neat, almost obsessively so, with everything in its place, and not a speck of dust visible anywhere. The furniture was simple but well maintained. The kitchen showed evidence of recent use, dishes stacked by the wash basin, a pot of beans still hanging over the banked coals in the fireplace. But the house was empty. The Harper family was nowhere to be found. Deputy Moss, searching the bedrooms upstairs, discovered something that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened in this house of horrors. Tucked under a loose floorboard in the smallest bedroom, presumably young Abigail's room, was a journal. The leather cover was worn, and the pages were filled with a child's handwriting that grew progressively more sophisticated as the entries advanced. The journal was dated beginning in November of 1801. Just weeks after the family had arrived in Red Creek, Moss brought the journal to Sheriff Cobb, and the two men read it together by the fading afternoon light, filtering through the small windows. What they read turned their blood to ice and provided the first glimpse into the twisted psychology that had driven the Harper family to murder. The early entries were mundane enough, a child's observations about their new home, complaints about chores, descriptions of the landscape. But even in these innocent passages, there were hints of something wrong. Abigail wrote about her father's lessons and her mother's preparation. She mentioned how the family was different from their neighbors, how they had a special purpose that others wouldn't understand. The phrases were vague, clearly filtered through a child's limited understanding, but they suggested indoctrination, a deliberate effort to set the family apart and justify whatever actions might follow. As the entries progressed through 1802 and into 1803, the journal took a darker turn. Abigail wrote about visitors who came to the farm at night, though it became clear these weren't willing guests. She described screams that frightened her, sounds of discipline being administered, and cryptic references to her father's belief that they were harvesting something from these unfortunate souls. The word she used repeatedly was essence. Her father believed that through killing, through taking life, they were somehow gathering power or grace or some quality that would elevate the family above the common run of humanity. One entry, dated July 1803, was particularly chilling. Father says that fear makes the essence stronger, that the more they suffer, the more we gain. Mother prepared another one tonight. I heard her singing the old songs, the ones from before when we lived in the mountains. Sometimes I remember that place, though Father says I was too young. Sometimes I think I remember other things too, things that happened before we came here. But Mother says those are dreams, not memories, and I shouldn't speak of them. The journal entries became increasingly fragmented as they progressed, as if Abigail's grip on reality was slipping. She wrote about nightmares that felt more real than waking life, about seeing the faces of the dead in her dreams, about a growing conviction that what her family was doing was wrong, evil, unforgivable. But she also wrote about her fear of them, particularly of her father, and her certainty that if she tried to run or tell anyone, she would become one of the victims rather than a perpetrator. The final entry, dated March 1805, just weeks before the flood, was barely legible, written in a shaky hand that suggested extreme distress. I can't anymore. God forgive me, I can't anymore. Sarah won't speak, hasn't spoken in weeks, just does what Father tells her like a puppet. The boys are worse than him now, especially Josiah. They enjoy it. I see it in their eyes when they bring them in. Mother has gone somewhere in her mind, somewhere far away. She goes through the motions, but there's nobody home behind her eyes. And Father. Father says we're getting close, that we've almost collected enough that soon we'll be ready for the final step. I don't know what that means, and I'm afraid to find out. If someone finds this, please know that I'm sorry. Please know that I wanted to stop it, but I was too afraid, too much of a coward. Please forgive me. Sheriff Cobb and Deputy Moss stood in that empty house, the journal between them, trying to comprehend the depths of depravity it revealed. But as horrifying as Abigail's words were, they were nothing compared to what the men digging in the fields were uncovering. By the time darkness forced them to halt the excavation that first day, they had found the remains of at least 7 individuals. The bodies had been buried in shallow graves, some little more than 3 feet deep, scattered throughout the property with no apparent pattern. The condition of the remains varied. Some were little more than bones, picked clean by time and insects, while others retained enough soft tissue to make identification theoretically possible, though the process would be gruesome. More disturbing than the number of bodies was the evidence of what had been done to them before death. Several skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. Others had cut marks on the bones consistent with knife wounds. One victim appeared to have been restrained so tightly that the bones of the wrists had been damaged by the pressure. The story told by these remains was one of violence, of suffering, of death that came slowly and painfully. As night fell on that terrible day, Sheriff Cobb posted guards around the Harper property and returned to Red Creek to organize a more systematic investigation. But his mind was reeling with questions that had no easy answers. Where was the Harper family? The house showed no signs of hasty departure. Food still in the pantry, clothes still in the wardrobes, personal items undisturbed. Had they somehow known the flood would expose their crimes? Had they fled just before the discovery, or had they left days or weeks earlier? And if they'd left, why had they abandoned everything? Why not at least attempt to hide the evidence, to burn the house, to do something to cover their tracks? More importantly, how many people had they killed? 7 bodies had been found that first day, but the property was 40 acres and they'd barely scratched the surface. How many more graves waited to be discovered? How many families would finally learn what had happened to their missing loved ones? And how many would never know? Would spend the rest of their lives wondering what became of the father or brother or daughter who vanished along a Tennessee road on a dark night in 1803 or 1804 or 1805. The excavation continued for weeks. More men were brought in from surrounding counties to help with the grim task. The property was divided into grids and searched systematically. Every anomaly in the soil was investigated. Every disturbed patch of ground was carefully excavated. And with each passing day, the body count rose. 10 victims, 15, 20, eventually. They stopped counting exact numbers because the remains had been so poorly preserved and so haphazardly buried that determining where one victim ended and another began became nearly impossible. The investigation revealed more than just bodies. In one of the outbuildings, searchers discovered what could only be described as a torture chamber. A small, windowless room with chains bolted to the walls, stains on the floor that were unmistakably blood, and crude implements whose purpose was sickeningly clear. This was where the Harper family had brought their victims, where they'd done whatever terrible things they'd done, before finally ending their captives' lives and burying them in the fields. The discovery sent shockwaves through Tennessee and beyond. Newspapers from as far away as Philadelphia and Charleston carried the story. The Harper horror, or the Red Creek murders, became the subject of countless articles, pamphlets, and even a hastily written book that purported to tell the full story, but mostly just speculated wildly about the family's motivations and methods. The fact that the Harpers themselves had vanished only added to the dark mystique of the case. They became bogeymen, monsters that parents used to frighten children into good behavior, a cautionary tale about the evil that could lurk behind closed doors and friendly facades. But for Sheriff William Cobb and the other men who'd seen the evidence firsthand, who'd excavated the graves and catalogued the remains and tried to match them to the long list of people who'd disappeared along that stretch of road, the Harper family wasn't some abstract symbol of evil. They were real flesh and blood killers who had murdered at least 24 people, probably more, and somehow escaped justice by vanishing without a trace. Cobb devoted the rest of his term as sheriff to trying to track them down. He sent descriptions of the family to lawmen throughout Tennessee and neighboring states. He investigated every report of a family matching their description, settling in a new area. He followed up on countless rumors and supposed sightings, traveling hundreds of miles on the slim hope that one of these leads might pan out. But the Harper family had disappeared as completely as their victims had, leaving behind only their empty farmhouse and the blood-soaked ground that testified to their crimes. The property itself became a place of dark pilgrimage for a time. Curiosity seekers would travel to Red Creek just to stand at the edge of the Harper farm and stare at the house where such horrors had occurred. Some claimed they could feel the evil emanating from the land, that the very air seemed heavier there, harder to breathe. Others reported hearing strange sounds at night, voices crying out, the sound of digging, footsteps pacing the floors of the empty house. Whether these accounts were genuine experiences, the products of overactive imaginations, or simply stories embellished for dramatic effect, they contributed to the growing legend of the Harper farm as a cursed place. A scar on the Tennessee landscape that would never fully heal. Eventually, the morbid interest faded. People found new horrors to obsess over, new mysteries to ponder. The Harper house fell into disrepair, its roof collapsing, its walls crumbling, until finally only the foundation remained, barely visible beneath the aggressive growth of Tennessee vegetation. The land itself was never sold, never settled, never cultivated again. It stood empty, a patch of wilderness in an increasingly civilized region, shunned by farmers who should have valued its rich, bottomland soil, but who couldn't bring themselves to plow ground so thoroughly soaked in innocent blood. But while the physical evidence of the Harper crimes slowly eroded under the twin forces of weather and time, questions about the family's fate persisted. The mystery of their disappearance spawned numerous theories, each more outlandish than the last. Some believed they'd killed themselves, that the bodies of the family members were buried somewhere on the property and had simply not been discovered. Others thought they'd fled west, heading into the largely unsettled territories beyond the Mississippi, where they could start fresh without the weight of their past hanging over them. A few even suggested that vigilante justice had caught up with them before the official investigation began, that someone in the community had taken matters into their own hands and disposed of the family, keeping silent about it to avoid legal complications. But there was another theory, darker and more disturbing than simple flight or death. This theory suggested that not all the Harper family had disappeared, that at least one of them, specifically young Abigail, whose journal had provided such crucial insight into the family's twisted mindset, had survived and escaped, carrying with her the psychological scars and twisted beliefs instilled by years of living in that house of death. The first hint that this theory might have merit came in 1809, 4 years after the Harper farm's secrets had been exposed. A family in western Kentucky reported that their daughter, who'd been traveling to visit relatives in Nashville, had disappeared during the journey. Investigation revealed that she'd last been seen in a small town about 30 miles from her destination, where she'd stopped at an inn for the night. The innkeeper recalled that she'd shared a room with another young woman traveling alone, a girl who gave her name as Abby Miller and who'd claimed to be journeying to join family in the area. This Abby Miller had left the inn early the next morning, before the innkeeper's daughter had awakened. The girl who'd been traveling to Nashville was never seen again, and when investigators looked into Abby Miller, they found no record of anyone by that name in the region, no family she could have been traveling to meet, no trace of her beyond that single night at the inn. The description of Abby Miller was vague. The innkeeper could only say she was young, probably in her mid-teens with dark hair and dark eyes, quiet and polite but somewhat odd in her manner. It wasn't much to go on, and initially no one connected her to the Harper case. But when a similar disappearance occurred 2 years later, under nearly identical circumstances, a young woman vanishing after sharing a room with a solitary female traveler named Abigail Martin, a pattern began to emerge that was impossible to ignore. Over the next decade, reports trickled in from across Tennessee and neighboring states. Always the same basic pattern. A woman or young girl traveling alone would disappear after encountering another young woman, also traveling alone, who gave her name as some variation of Abigail. The descriptions of this mysterious figure varied. Sometimes she was described as in her teens, sometimes her early 20s, sometimes older. Sometimes she had dark hair, sometimes light. The inconsistencies led many to dismiss the theory that these disappearances were connected, that they could possibly be the work of a single individual. But there were consistencies too. The woman always traveled alone. She always gave a name that was some variant of Abigail, and most tellingly, she always seemed to target vulnerable women, those traveling without male companions, those who were young or naive, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victims disappeared completely, their bodies never found, just like the victims who'd been buried on the Harper farm years earlier. Sheriff Cobb, even after his term ended and he returned to private life, never stopped looking for the Harper family. The case had consumed him, had become a personal mission that transcended his official duties. When the reports of these disappearances began to accumulate, he recognized the possible connection immediately. He compiled what information he could, corresponded with lawmen in other states, tried to establish a timeline and pattern that might help predict where this mysterious Abigail might strike next. In 1814, Cobb traveled to Georgia on the strength of a report that a young woman matching Abigail Harper's description had been seen in a small town near the South Carolina border. The woman had been working as a servant in a boarding house, keeping to herself, giving her name as Abigail Coleman. But when Cobb arrived and began asking questions, he found that Abigail Coleman had left town 3 days earlier, and a young woman who'd been staying at the boarding house had vanished at the same time. Cobb visited the room where Abigail Coleman had lived for those few months. It was bare, stripped of anything personal, but in the small fireplace he found scraps of burned paper. Carefully extracting them from the ashes, he was able to make out a few words on the least damaged fragments. One phrase was legible enough to read, "Must collect the essence." Father was right. It was the first solid evidence that the woman they were chasing was indeed Abigail Harper, that she had survived whatever fate had befallen the rest of her family, and that she was continuing their work, hunting and killing innocent victims with a methodology she'd learned from her father and brothers during those terrible years on the Red Creek farm. Cobb redoubled his efforts, but Abigail, if indeed it was her, stayed always one step ahead. She seemed to have inherited or learned her father's talent for reading people, for identifying those who were vulnerable, isolated, unlikely to be missed immediately. She never stayed in one place long enough to establish ties or attract sustained attention. She worked menial jobs that provided room and board, kept her head down, and when the opportunity arose, she struck, adding another victim to her toll before moving on to the next town, the next state, the next identity. The trail went cold in 1817 in a small town in Arkansas Territory. A woman named Abigail Fields had been living there for several months when she suddenly disappeared, leaving behind an unpaid room and a few personal effects. The landlady reported nothing unusual about her tenant. Quiet, paid on time, caused no trouble. But 2 days after Abigail Fields vanished, a young woman who'd been staying at the same boarding house was reported missing. The pattern held, but this time there was no further sighting. No new town where a lone woman named Abigail took up residence. No new disappearances that fit the profile. Cobb continued his investigation for several more years, growing increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress. In his later years, he would tell anyone who'd listen about the Harper family, about the daughter who'd escaped justice and continued to kill, about the evil that had been unleashed from that Tennessee farm and was still loose somewhere in the world. But without new evidence, without concrete leads to follow, even his dedication couldn't keep the case alive indefinitely. William Cobb died in 1829, taking with him an encyclopedic knowledge of the Harper case and an unshakable belief that Abigail Harper was still out there somewhere, still hunting, still killing, driven by whatever twisted psychology her father had instilled in her during those formative years. His personal effects included volumes of notes on the case, maps with possible sightings marked, and a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to Abigail Harper, wheresoever she may be, in which he detailed the evidence against her and pleaded with her to turn herself in, to seek help, to stop the cycle of violence before even more innocent people died. But if Abigail Harper ever read that letter, if she ever learned of Cobb's death or his decades-long pursuit of her, she left no indication. The mysterious disappearances continued sporadically over the following decades, though whether they were the work of the same individual or simply coincidental crimes inspired by the Harper legend became impossible to determine with certainty. The mystery of what happened to the Harper family, where they went, whether they died or lived on in hiding, whether Abigail survived and continued their murderous work, or whether the sightings were simply mistaken identity and wishful thinking by people who wanted to believe the case could still be solved, remained one of Tennessee's most enduring dark legends. The farm itself stood as a monument to their crimes, a place that even in abandonment seemed to radiate malevolence, as if the ground itself had absorbed the evil that had been perpetrated there and would never fully release it. It wasn't until the early 1990s, nearly 2 centuries after the Harper family's disappearance, that modern technology and renewed interest would shed new light on the case. A graduate student at the University of Tennessee, researching early frontier crimes for her thesis, became fascinated by the Harper story. Emily Jennings spent months digging through old records, court documents, newspaper archives, and personal journals from the period, piecing together a more complete picture of the family and their crimes than had ever existed before. What Jennings discovered was that the Harpers hadn't simply appeared in Red Creek out of nowhere in 1801. Through careful research into property records and tax documents from Pennsylvania and Virginia, she traced the family back through several previous locations, each one abandoned under circumstances that, in retrospect, seemed deeply suspicious. The pattern was consistent. The family would arrive in a new place, settle in a relatively isolated location, keep to themselves for a period of time, and then local people would begin to disappear. Eventually, the family would move on before suspicion could coalesce into action, leaving behind no obvious evidence of their crimes, but a trail of unexplained vanishings that had never been connected until Jennings started pulling the threads together. The earliest record Jennings could find placed the Harper family in the mountains of western Virginia in 1793. Court records from a nearby county mentioned Elijah Harper being questioned in connection with the disappearance of a traveling preacher, but no charges were filed for lack of evidence. 2 years later, the Harpers appeared in western Pennsylvania, where they stayed for 3 years before moving on, and during those 3 years, at least 5 people vanished from the surrounding area. Then they moved to eastern Kentucky for 2 years before finally settling in Tennessee in 1801. Jennings' research suggested that the Harper family might have been killing for more than a decade before they were finally discovered, and that the body count from the Red Creek farm represented only a fraction of their total victims. If her timeline was correct, Elijah Harper and his family might have murdered 50 or more people during their years of wandering, always staying ahead of suspicion, always moving before they could be caught. But Jennings's most startling discovery came from a letter she found in the archives of a Pennsylvania historical society. The letter, dated 1842, was from a woman named Sarah Coleman to her sister in Philadelphia. In it, she mentioned in passing that her employer, a wealthy widow, had recently hired a new companion, a quiet, middle-aged woman named Abigail, who claimed to have lost her own family years ago in a fire. The description was vague, but what caught Jennings' attention was a postscript added to the letter several months later. The strangest thing, Abigail left quite suddenly last week, and Mrs. Henderson's niece, who'd been visiting, has disappeared. They're saying the girl ran off with a young man, but Mrs. Henderson doesn't believe it. She thinks something terrible happened, and she can't shake the feeling that Abigail knows more than she said before she left. The whole business has left me quite unsettled. If this Abigail was indeed Abigail Harper, it meant she'd survived until at least 1842, 41 years after her family had arrived in Red Creek, and was still killing. She would have been nearly 50 years old by that point, still traveling, still hunting, still driven by whatever compulsion her father had instilled in her decades earlier. And if she lived to 1842, who's to say she didn't survive even longer, without a body, without any definitive proof of her death? The question of Abigail Harper's ultimate fate remained tantalizingly open. Jennings published her findings in 1994, sparking renewed interest in the Harper case. True crime enthusiasts and amateur historians descended on Red Creek, looking for any remaining evidence of the family's presence, any clues that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. The site of the Harper farm, overgrown and largely forgotten for nearly 2 centuries, once again became a destination for the morbidly curious. It was during this renewed interest that authorities made the decision to conduct a final, comprehensive archaeological survey of the property. Using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques unavailable to the original investigators, a team from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the State Archaeological Survey began mapping the entire 40-acre site, looking for any graves that might have been missed during the 1805 investigation. What they found exceeded even the darkest expectations. The original excavation had been thorough for its time, but it had focused primarily on the areas immediately around the farmhouse and outbuildings. The new survey revealed anomalies throughout the property, disturbances in the soil consistent with graves, concentrated particularly in a wooded area near the creek that had never been thoroughly searched. Permission was granted to excavate, and in the summer of 1995, the grim work began once more. The team uncovered the remains of at least 15 additional individuals, bringing the confirmed body count from the Harper farm alone to more than 40. The bones showed evidence of similar trauma to those found in 1805, violence, restraint, suffering before death. But there were differences too. Some of the remains from the newer excavation appeared older, as if they'd been buried earlier than the victims from the original investigation. This supported Jennings' theory that the Harpers had been killing for years before arriving in Red Creek, and that they might have brought some of their earlier victims' bodies with them when they moved, perhaps as part of whatever twisted belief system motivated their crimes. Among the remains, archaeologists found artifacts that helped paint a more complete picture of the victims: a woman's wedding ring, a child's toy carved from wood, a pocket watch engraved with initials. These personal effects were heartbreaking reminders that each set of bones represented a real person, someone with a life and loved ones and hopes for the future, all of it stolen by the Harper family's incomprehensible evil. The excavation also uncovered something unexpected. beneath the foundation of the farmhouse itself, carefully concealed in a crude vault constructed of stone and clay. Investigators found a box containing a collection of items that could only be described as trophies. There were locks of hair tied with ribbon, dozens of them, each presumably from a different victim. There were small personal items, a mother-of-pearl button, a brass compass, a woman's hairpin, a man's signet ring, and there was a journal, different from the one found by Deputy Moss in 1805, this one in a masculine hand that the handwriting experts identified as likely belonging to Elijah Harper himself. The journal was badly deteriorated, and much of it was illegible. But the portions that could be read revealed a mind steeped in a bizarre fusion of religious mania and pseudo-philosophical justification for murder. Harper wrote about harvesting souls and collecting essence and ascending beyond the mortal limitation. He described an elaborate belief system, apparently one he'd developed over years, in which killing, particularly killing that involved suffering and fear, somehow transferred power or life force or some intangible quality from the victim to the murderer. The more people they killed, he believed, the more powerful and enlightened the family would become, until eventually they would transcend human limitations entirely. It was the closest thing to an explanation for the Harper family's crimes that investigators would ever find, and it was utterly insane. There was no coherent philosophy here, no system of belief that made sense even on its own terms. It was simply the ramblings of a deeply disturbed mind trying to justify acts of monstrous evil by wrapping them in pseudo-spiritual language. But it did explain the methodical nature of the killings, the careful selection of victims, and the family's apparent lack of remorse. In Elijah Harper's twisted worldview, they weren't committing murder. They were engaging in a form of spiritual practice, harvesting what they needed to achieve their ultimate goal. What that ultimate goal was remained unclear. The final legible entry in Harper's journal, dated February 1805, read, "We are nearly ready. The collection is almost complete. Soon we will perform the final ritual, and the transformation will be upon us. The family will ascend, and all our years of work will bear fruit. The lesser souls we have consumed will fuel our rise, and we will become as gods among men." Whatever this final ritual was supposed to be, there was no evidence it ever took place. The Harper family disappeared just months after this entry was written, their grandiose plans apparently abandoned or interrupted. Whether they fled because they sensed the authorities closing in, or whether something else happened that caused them to vanish, remained a mystery that even the most advanced modern investigation techniques couldn't solve. The 1995 excavation concluded with a memorial service for the victims. Representatives from families whose ancestors had disappeared along the Red Creek Road attended, grateful to finally have confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones, even if that confirmation was 2 centuries late. The remains were given proper burial in the Red Creek Cemetery, with a monument erected that listed the names of all the confirmed victims and included a line for the unknown others whose names are lost to time. The Harper farm. Property was purchased by the state of Tennessee and designated as a historical site, though not one that's open to the public. It remains undeveloped, a piece of wilderness in an increasingly built-up region, visited only occasionally by researchers and historians. A small plaque at the edge of the property marks it as the site of significant historical events, though it doesn't go into detail about exactly what those events were. The full horror of what happened there is considered too disturbing for casual historical interest, reserved instead for serious students of crime and psychology. But even with the property secured and the victims memorialized, even with scholarly articles written and documentary programs produced about the case, certain questions refuse to be answered. The fate of the Harper family remains unknown. No bodies were ever discovered that could definitively be identified as Elijah, Martha, or their children. No records were ever found of them settling elsewhere under different names. They simply vanished, as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only their crimes as proof that they were ever real at all. And then there's Abigail. The question of whether she survived, whether she continued her family's work, whether the pattern of disappearances that plagued the southeastern United States throughout the 19th century was the work of a single long-lived killer or simply coincidental crimes, has never been definitively resolved. Emily Jennings, in her follow-up research, traced reports of suspicious disappearances involving a woman named Abigail as far forward as the 1880s. Though the trail becomes increasingly tenuous, the further from 1805 it gets. If Abigail Harper lived that long, she would have been in her 80s, elderly by any standard. But not impossibly so. The last credible sighting that Jennings uncovered was from 1887 in a small town in Missouri. A traveling salesman reported meeting an elderly woman at an inn who introduced herself as Abigail Crane. He described her as peculiar, very old, but with eyes that seemed unnaturally alert, and a way of looking at people that made him profoundly uncomfortable. She asked him many questions about where he was traveling, whether he had family expecting him, whether anyone would miss him if he didn't arrive on time. The specificity of her questions disturbed him enough that he left the inn early the next morning and reported the conversation to the local sheriff, suggesting the woman might be planning a robbery. When the sheriff investigated, he found that Abigail Crane had left the inn during the night, and a young woman who'd been staying in the same boarding house, a woman traveling alone to join her husband, who'd gone ahead to Homestead in Kansas, had disappeared. Her belongings were still in her room, but she was never seen again. The salesman provided a detailed description of Abigail Crane, a woman in her 80s, thin to the point of emaciation, with white hair and deeply lined skin, but with dark eyes that held an intensity that seemed wrong for someone her age. It was the last documented sighting of anyone matching Abigail Harper's description and fitting the pattern of her suspected crimes. If it was her, and there's no way to know for certain, it would mean she killed for more than 80 years, from childhood until extreme old age, amassing a victim count that could easily be in the hundreds. It would make her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, operating in plain sight for decades, always staying one step ahead of detection, driven by the twisted belief system her father had instilled in her during those formative years on the Red Creek farm. But without proof, without a body or a confession or any definitive evidence, it remains speculation, dark speculation. Certainly, but speculation nonetheless. Abigail Harper's fate, like so much about the Harper family, is a question without an answer, a mystery that refuses to be solved no matter how much investigation or research is devoted to it. Today, more than 200 years after the Harper family committed their crimes, the case continues to fascinate. True crime podcasts dissect the evidence. Amateur historians propose new theories about where the family went or whether Abigail survived. Paranormal investigators visit the site of the farm, looking for ghosts or evidence of supernatural evil, as if the human evil that was perpetrated there wasn't horrifying enough without adding supernatural elements to it. And in Red Creek itself, the older residents still speak of the Harper family in hushed tones, passing down stories to their children and grandchildren about the farm that became a killing ground, about the family that turned murder into a way of life, about the evil that seeped into the Tennessee soil and has never quite left. Some claim the land is still cursed, that nothing good can grow there, that animals refuse to enter that patch of ground. Others say they've heard screams on quiet nights, seen lights moving through the old property when no one living should be there, felt a presence that watches from the tree line where the Harper farmhouse once stood. Whether these accounts represent genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the power of suggestion, the weight of history pressing down on a place where terrible things happened, is a question that each person must answer for themselves. What's undeniable is that the Harper farm left a scar on Tennessee, on the collective memory of a region, a reminder that the worst monsters aren't the ones in folklore or fairy tales. They're the ones that look like ordinary people, that live in ordinary houses, that hide behind ordinary facades while committing extraordinary evil. The Harper family turned their farm into a killing ground, murdered dozens, perhaps hundreds of innocent people, and vanished without facing justice. Their crimes echo across the centuries, a dark chapter in American history that refuses to close, a story that continues to disturb and fascinate in equal measure. The physical evidence of their evil has been excavated and documented and memorialized, but the psychological legacy of what they did, the questions they left unanswered, the fear they instilled in the people who lived through those years and discovered what their quiet neighbors had been doing behind that high fence, that legacy lives on, As potent now as it was in 1805, when Sheriff Cobb first walked into that empty farmhouse and realized that the whispers had been right all along. The land along Red Creek remembers. The Tennessee Hills remember. And in the collective memory of a region, in the cautionary tales told to children and the historical accounts written by scholars, the Harper family lives on, not as people, but as symbols of the evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, in the most unexpected of places, wearing the face of a family just trying to make a living on the American frontier. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the mist rolls in from Red Creek and settles over the Tennessee Hills, locals say you can still hear them, the screams of the victims, the sound of shovels biting into earth, the whispered prayers of those who knew they were about to die. Whether these sounds are real or imagined, whether they're the product of genuine haunting or simply the power of suggestion amplified by knowledge of what happened there, doesn't really matter. The horror of the Harper farm doesn't need ghosts or supernatural elements to be terrifying. The simple fact of what they did, the methodical way they selected and murdered innocent people, the years they spent perfecting their evil craft, that's horror enough for any reasonable person. And somewhere, perhaps buried in an unmarked grave, perhaps recorded in documents that have yet to be discovered, perhaps even lost forever to time and decay, lies the answer to the final question: what happened to the Harper family? Did they die by their own hands, carrying their secrets to whatever judgment awaits beyond death? Did they scatter and live on under assumed names, their murderous past hidden beneath new identities? Did Abigail survive and continue her father's work for decades, adding countless more victims to the family's toll? Or is there some other explanation, some truth that's even stranger and more disturbing than the theories that have been proposed over the past 2 centuries? We may never know. The Harper family guarded their secrets well in life, and those secrets remain guarded still, locked away behind the barriers of time and evidence destroyed or never created in the first place. What we're left with is the physical proof of their crimes, the bones in the ground, the artifacts in the archives, the journal entries that provide a glimpse into minds twisted beyond redemption. And we're left with the knowledge that for at least 4 years, possibly longer, a family of killers lived and worked and murdered in plain sight, hidden only by the isolation of frontier life and the reluctance of their neighbors to believe that such evil could exist so close to home. The Harper farm stands as a monument to that evil, a reminder that monsters are real and that they sometimes look like ordinary people living ordinary lives. The mist still rolls in from Red Creek on quiet mornings. The Tennessee Hills still wear their green coat of vegetation, beautiful and eternal, and utterly indifferent to the human dramas played out beneath them. And the land that once belonged to the Harper family still lies fallow and untouched, a wound in the landscape that has never quite healed. A place where evil once flourished and where, some say, its echo can still be heard in the whisper of wind through abandoned fields and the rustle of leaves over ground that holds too many secrets. This is the story of the Harper family, of the farm they turned into a killing ground, of the victims whose names we know and the countless others whose names are lost. It's a story without a clean ending, without justice served or mystery solved, without the comfort of knowing that the evil was punished and the innocent vindicated. So it's messy and disturbing and frustratingly incomplete, just like so much of history, just like so much of the human experience of confronting darkness. But it's a story that needs to be told, if only to remember the victims, to acknowledge what they suffered, to ensure that their deaths, meaningless and terrible as they were, aren't forgotten by the passage of time. They were real people, with real lives and real families and real dreams, and they deserved better than to die in terror on a Tennessee farm, buried in shallow graves by people who saw them as nothing more than fuel for an insane fantasy of transcendence and power. So we remember. We tell the story. We visit the monument in Red Creek Cemetery and read the names of the confirmed victims. We acknowledge that the Harper family existed, that they committed atrocities, that justice, if it ever caught up with them, came too late to save the dozens of people they killed. And we carry forward the uncomfortable truth that they embodied, that evil is real, that it sometimes wears a human face, and that the monsters aren't always the ones we expect them to be. The farm is quiet now. The killing stopped more than 2 centuries ago, but the land remembers and the story lives on, passed down through generations, studied by scholars, dissected by true crime enthusiasts, whispered about in the darkening hours when the Tennessee hills cast long shadows and the mist rises from Red Creek like the ghosts of all those forgotten dead. The Harper family may be gone, vanished into history or death or some combination of both, but what they did remains, carved into the land, embedded in the collective memory, a dark chapter in American history that refuses to close. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the abandoned fields, where corn once grew over shallow graves, some people say you can still hear them, the victims and the killers both, forever bound to that cursed patch of ground, forever replaying the horror that unfolded, there in those terrible years when the frontier was young and justice was slow, and a family of killers found the perfect place to pursue their murderous obsession, the Harper farm, the killing ground, the place where evil lived and thrived and ultimately consumed itself, leaving behind only questions and bones and a darkness that even 2 centuries of time has failed to fully dispel. Remember their names. Remember their stories. And remember that the worst evils in human history are the ones committed not by fantastical monsters, but by ordinary people who chose to embrace darkness, who transformed homes into hells and families into instruments of death. The Harper family did that. They made that choice, and the echoes of that choice still reverberate through the Tennessee hills, a warning and a remembrance, a story that disturbs precisely because it's true. The mist rises, the creek flows on, and the land remembers, as it always will, the family who turned their farm into a killing ground and vanished into history, leaving behind only horror and questions that may never be answered.